All right, so today we're talking about divine command theory as the more particular topic. But in general, I want us to think, to sort of use divine command theory to think about the relationship between God and morality. As you saw in the text for today, divine command theory, a very simplistic version of it, isn't very tenable, but that doesn't mean that there's no interesting relationship between God and morality. So we're going to try to think more about that. And toward that end, today's learning goals are as follows. First, I want you to understand the basic structure of divine command theory. So it is possible to construct a sort of simple ethics based on divine command. And so we'll try to get at that structure. Then I want you to be able to explain and critically evaluate the Euthyphro problem as a problem about the source of moral value, and in particular about worries that divine command theory is a circular ethics. So we'll talk more about that. Then finally, I want you to be able to form and articulate your own view about the relationship between God and moral value. So that's the more general goal for today. So those are our learning goals. And as a quick review of ethical theory, the central questions of ethical theory are, first, what is the ultimate good or goods? What is the source of moral value? It's often thought that the ultimate good is the source of moral value. And then secondly, the second big question that we've been focusing on, the second big ethical question, is how do we determine to act rightly? And what is acting rightly? What is it that we ought to do? Views that we will be considering in coming weeks. So next class period on Wednesday, we'll talk about deontologism. This is the Kantian theory that agential integrity, and this is kind of a confusing concept that we'll talk about, is the ultimate good. And the easier thing to understand about deontologism is that we should always act from moral duty. There are certain moral duties that are absolute. In any circumstances, you have to act from duty. So as an example of this, we'll talk about lying and why Kant thinks you can never lie, or you shouldn't ever lie, rather. Even in cases where you'd save a bunch of lives, you can't lie, according to Kant. And then the second view that we're going to consider, and this is going to be in the context of our last unit on meaning and the good life, so we'll consider virtue ethics, which makes human flourishing, sometimes translated as happiness, the ultimate good. And it claims that in determining what's the right thing to do, you should just think about what the virtuous person would do, right? So those are views that are coming up. The view that we're considering today is divine command theory. And here's the structure of it. So remember, utilitarianism claimed that happiness, this sort of like psychological kind of conception of happiness as pleasure or pleasant experience, is the ultimate good. The right action is the action that has the best consequences for the most people in terms of happiness or pleasure. And the good life is just a life of pleasure, right? Maybe a life of pleasure rightly ordered or something like that, but that's the basic gist of utilitarianism. Today we're talking about divine command theory, so all the way on the right of the screen. The ultimate good is whatever God desires, whatever God wants, that's the ultimate good. That's what good is defined in terms of. What's good? Well, whatever God wants. Right action is whatever action God commands, right? So if God tells you, that you have to go murder your son, like he said to Abraham, you got to do it. That's what you got to do. You got to, get a bunch of thickets and go, build a little altar and get ready to murder your son. The good life, according to divine command theory, is a pious life, a life that pleases the gods or God, depending on if you're a monotheist or a polytheist. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Okay. So that, in broad strokes, is divine command theory. And the answers to the central questions of ethics that divine command theory presents to us are that the source of good or the value of good is somehow grounded in God or God's will or God's authority, something like that. What you should do is whatever God commands you to do. Now, you might ask, who holds a strict divine command theory? Like, are there people walking around, philosophers or otherwise, who say like, I'm a divine command theorist? And then when you ask them like, well, what should we do in this particular situation? Would they say like, I don't know, let's consult all like the, scriptural texts and see what God commands, etc. It's not clear that anybody holds divine command theory in that form, although there are some like really sophisticated defenses of it. If you're interested in divine command theory, I would recommend two places to look. One, there's been a lot of sort of theological work, academic theological work on divine commands and the nature of divine commands. Two, you should probably look at Robert Adams, who's got a book on divine command theory, and he tries to sort of spell it out in a plausible way. I said two, but I'm going to say three. Third, if you're interested in divine commands, the nature of divine commands, you might take a look at Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is a philosopher. Forget if he's contemporaneous with Kant, but he was around that time. And he writes really eloquently about Abraham in particular, Abraham and Isaac, and divine commands, and why this is both like a problem for Christianity, but also some deep insight into ethics that Christianity has. Those are three people to look for if you're looking to like locate divine command theory in the actual world. But it's not clear that anybody sort of, that ordinary people are just going to hold some sort of simplistic divine command theory. Why? Well, because it's got this huge problem, this problem that we identified in today's reading. The problem, as I'm going to explain it, is a problem of circularity. Basically, divine command theory, Socrates' objection to divine command theory, is that it's definitionally circular. Okay, what does that mean? Well, a definition is circular if it's defined in terms that essentially depend on the terms being defined for their meaning. Right? So if you say to me, what is a good definition of, the color blue? And I say, oh, well, it's the color that all blue things have. It's a circular definition. The key term or the key concept in my definition depends for its meaning on the term that I'm supposed to be defining. So circular definitions are uninformative. If they're true, they're trivially true, right? Blue things are blue. That's trivially true. Of course they are, just because of the meaning of the words. It doesn't tell you anything about the nature of blue or colors or anything like that. And so it's uninformative, right? So the problem isn't that divine command theory is not true, or at least that's not the problem Socrates is worried about. The problem is that it's totally uninformative. It's circular. Now, when we apply this to the particular case, you can see just even in sort of a distillation of Socrates' main worry, why he thinks this is a circular view, right? So the good is to be determined or fixed, defined in terms of piety. And piety is supposed to be whatever the gods love. But it's not clear that what the gods love can be defined in terms that don't invoke piety in the first place. So Socrates asks, is this pious because it's loved by the gods? Or is it loved by the gods because it's pious, right? So there's sort of a direction of explanation question. What explains what here? So the objection that Socrates is articulating in the Euthyphro is this. Euthyphro gives us a circular definition of moral value. And so Socrates shows that he hasn't given us a clear account or theory of the source of moral value. For all Socrates has shown, Euthyphro might be right, that the gods love piety, and maybe pious actions are of value, at least partly in virtue of their loving it. But, Socrates claims, this leaves the crucial question of the nature of morality, the source of morality, unanswered. What makes something good and what determines right action? Now, in today's readings, in the Antony piece that we read for today, and that we're going to get a presentation on shortly, she raises a second problem for divine command theory. And this is the problem that if divine command theory is right, it seems like God could make utterly immoral things moral simply by commanding them, right? So if we define right action and goodness in terms of whatever it is that God or the gods desire or want, you might ask the question, well, what if the gods want something we take to be immoral? What if they think, murder, for instance, is moral? It's not totally clear that divine command theorists are committed to this. They might say things to get around it, but it's certainly a problem for divine command theory in kind of the simplistic version that we're considering in the context of the Euthyphro. Okay, so here's a broader question that the Euthyphro problem brings up and that the reading today brings up. What is the relationship between God and morality? So say you believe that God exists, and say you're not a moral nihilist, which you shouldn't be, because that's a crazy view. So you think there's a God, you think some things are moral and some things are immoral. You got to answer this question, or at least, it's an interesting question to think about. What is the relationship between God and morality? Here are a few options. You might think with the divine command theorist that God is the divine moral lawgiver. You might think that God is the source of moral value and moral laws without having to issue divine commands. So maybe God's sort of being, just God's nature as the greatest possible being, somehow can ground things like moral value and moral laws without God having to command them in any sense. Similarly, you might think that God creates a natural order with inherent moral laws, right? So you think maybe God, is sort of creating the world or the universe the same way that like a game designer is designing some particular game, right? The rules of the game don't constantly depend on the game designers giving us some sort of command. This is how the game ought to be played. The game designer sets that up, and then the rules of the game are kind of internal to that game or that activity or that practice. Maybe God's relationship to morality is something just more like that. Maybe morality is inherent in creation and God is bound by it just as we are. This is an interesting possibility. It would be somewhat heterodox. You wouldn't be able to say that God is all powerful because God is limited at least by one thing, moral laws or morality. Finally, here's another view. Morality and God's will are totally separable. Neither depends on the other in any way. So again, another sort of heterodox view. You might think, that God is a powerful being, maybe not an all-powerful being. Maybe God's generally good, but maybe not all good or all benevolent. So maybe God is, as God's more depicted in the Old Testament, somewhat of a tyrant, right? That cares for people, but also sometimes asks them to murder entire groups of people, things like that. So maybe that's the relationship. Maybe considering morality and the nature of ethics gives us interesting information about the nature of God. Maybe it's at odds with some of the conceptual or the traditional ways of conceiving of God. Okay, so those are the sort of questions. Those are the kinds of views that I want you to be thinking about. And I want you to notice that which of those options you select, or if you come up with a whole different option, is going to depend both on your views of ethics, the nature of ethics, right and wrong, whether there are moral absolutes, whether there aren't, etc., and on your views about the nature of God. Maybe your views about the nature of God are things that you get from some particular religious tradition, in which case, whatever view you have of the relationship between God and morality is going to have to be consistent with maybe years of doctrine and tradition and things like that. So maybe there's a lot of theoretical constraints. Or maybe that's not the case. Maybe you think God exists, but you don't think any particular religion captures the nature of God very well. So maybe you think by reflecting on ethics and the nature of ethics, we can learn more about the nature of God, that sort of thing. So the point is just to illustrate the interconnectedness of these sort of different philosophical views. Ideally, your views on God should cohere with your views on morality. These should cohere with your views in epistemology and in metaphysics, all these other sort of domains of philosophy, these philosophical domains. And so it's important to think about these issues in connection with one another and not just in isolation. Here's a couple big picture conclusions. So we've now looked at two separate ethical theories. Some major objections to those. We looked at utilitarianism. We've looked at divine command theory now. On Wednesday, we're going to take a look at a third option, Kantian deontologism. And we're going to finish off the class by looking at Aristotelian ethics, virtue ethics, and see if that can provide us with an answer not just to some of these ethical questions, but also the question of what provides life with meaning in the first place, what a good life would be, what a meaningful life would be.